A white passenger kicked an infant's stroller mid-flight, but the father's swift intervention left the entire cabin in stunned silence. A white passenger kicked the infant's stroller, thinking no one would stop him. He didn't realize the father was ready to respond instantly, turning a reckless act into an immediate lesson. The moment the stroller tipped, the cabin's power dynamics flipped. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the instant true authority rises. The first thing Darian Keller noticed was not the temperature of the cabin, nor the warm lighting overhead, nor even the gentle weight of his son, Laron, nestled beneath the blanket in the compact stroller. It was the sudden silence. It happened just as the final passenger stepped on board, an unusually tall man in a blindingly white coat, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the aisle like a man already displeased with the world. His footsteps clicked sharply against the floor, unhurried but heavy, as if each step was a private protest against the existence of everyone else on the plane. Darian had just secured the stroller beside his seat in row 16A, the brake softly locked in place. He reached down to tuck the edge of Laron's blanket beneath the baby's shoulder with careful precision, whispering a soothing, "There you go, little one," without expecting a reply. The boy had been sleeping soundly since the terminal, his chest rising in tiny, even breaths. The hum of the aircraft's ventilation system had helped lull him deeper into rest. Then came the voice. "They really let people bring furniture on board now," the man muttered to no one, his tone like vinegar poured into a cup of tea. He hadn't stopped walking, but his words hung in the air long enough to demand attention. Darian looked up and instinctively glanced around to see if anyone else had heard it. A middle-aged man across the aisle adjusted his headphones, uninterested. A young traveler in the window seat beside Darian blinked and returned to his phone. No one engaged. So Darian did what he always did. He focused inward. Let it go. His goal wasn't conflict. It was Varcrest. He had one shot to present his autonomous rail system to the investors at Halvern Dynamics, and if the pitch landed, it could mean a future for his engineering startup that wasn't built on month-to-month loans and weekend contract jobs. That mattered far more than one man's passive-aggressive commentary. The tall passenger, later introduced by his boarding stub as Warren Gellin, moved to row 17, directly behind Darian, with a visible stiffness in his posture. As he stowed his briefcase with loud, deliberate motions, Darian felt a presence settled just behind him. Not the kind you ignore. One that seemed to breathe on the back of your neck without ever making contact. Reddick Varson, the senior flight attendant, strolled past with his practiced smile, nodding briefly at Darian as he passed. Darian appreciated the gesture. So far, the crew had been courteous and helpful. Even the purser, Jalen Court, had made a friendly comment earlier about the stroller's sleek design. But Warren's discontent didn't fade. It grew. His sighs deepened. His eyes moved between the seat in front of him and the small stroller at Darian's feet like he was measuring something he intended to argue about. He hadn't yet spoken again, but his body language was loud, legs shifting, shoulders rolling, hands gripping the armrests. Darian tried not to look back, but he felt it. The seatbelt sign chimed softly as the final boarding checks began. Passengers adjusted themselves for the journey ahead. Phones dimmed, bags zipped. The cabin lights were lowered to a soft glow. Somewhere near the rear, a child laughed and was gently hushed. It should have been a peaceful moment. Instead, a low-grade static tension passed through row 16 like an invisible ripple. Then came a whisper, not loud, not theatrical, but meant to be heard by someone. Darian turned just slightly, enough to see Warren standing in the aisle again, his fingers pressed to the back of the seat in front of him. His gaze wasn't on his own belongings. It was fixed, sharp, and pointed on the stroller. He leaned in closer, lips barely moving. Darian heard only fragments, a blur of quiet syllables, but the final two words rang out in a distinct tone that didn't belong to casual complaint, a tone that sent a chill through the back of his neck. Not today. Darian blinked. Had he heard that right? Warren turned and sat back down without another word, the seat creaking beneath him as though it too disapproved of his weight. The cabin door sealed shut with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The aircraft began to roll away from the gate, and the moment passed. But Darian's fingers remained gently curled around the stroller handle. His chest rose slower. His jaw tightened, though he kept his face neutral for Laron's sake. He told himself it meant nothing. But something had already begun to unravel, and he could not shake the cold syllables echoing inside his mind. Not today. The first sign of trouble came not with shouting, but with a sound far quieter. Tap, tap, tap. The dull, agitated rhythm of a man's polished shoes bouncing against the floor broke through the aircraft's subtle white noise. Darian Keller, seated calmly in row 14 with his infant son, Laron, in a compact stroller at his side, glanced back once. Just one row behind him, Warren Gellin sat rigid, arms folded tightly across his chest, eyes darting down toward the stroller like it was a ticking device. The plane began its taxi toward the runway, the usual vibrations rippling through the floor. Laron remained asleep, his tiny fists tucked near his face under the edge of a light gray blanket. Darian adjusted the stroller's brake again, though it had not moved, his fingers brushing the handle in a habitual gesture of protection. He had done nothing wrong. The stroller was permitted by airline policy, carefully folded and positioned according to regulations. He had even shown the documentation during boarding, but rules meant little to men like Warren. Tap, tap, tap. Then a low grunt, drawn out deliberately. Warren exhaled through his nose, loud enough for Darian to hear. The man shifted in his seat with theatrical irritation, muttering to himself in clipped fragments. Obstruction. Irresponsible. Whole aisle compromised. The words weren't addressed to anyone, but they were loud enough to be heard, loud enough to invite reaction. Darian said nothing. Senior Attendant Reddick Varson passed down the aisle, checking belts, his clipboard tucked under one arm. He paused briefly near Warren, who flashed a tight-lipped grimace. Reddick offered a cordial, "Everything all right, sir?" in his trained, even voice. Warren replied without looking up, "I'd be better if I didn't have to share a cabin with rolling hazards." The comment floated toward Darian like a poison cloud. Reddick gave a short nod, as if unsure how to respond, then continued his walk without further comment. Darian's jaw tightened for a moment, but he remained still. Laron stirred slightly, making a soft sound. Darian leaned forward and quietly hummed near his son's ear, soothing the movement. The baby settled again. But Warren didn't. He shifted forward in his seat, craned his neck, and made a point of sighing. "You'd think people would check these things at the gate," he said, louder now, as if inviting others into the conversation. Still, no one spoke. The atmosphere around row 14 grew heavier, denser, like oxygen being slowly siphoned away. Then came the first breach of protocol. As the plane neared the runway for takeoff clearance, the seatbelt signs lit and a chime rang out. The intercom voice requested all passengers to remain seated. Yet Warren unbuckled and stood up, adjusting his white coat with sharp, fussy movements. His legs swung into the aisle and he pointed directly at the stroller. "This needs to be stored away from passengers," he snapped. Heads turned. The man's tone had bypassed suggestion and landed squarely in command. Reddick Varson returned quickly, this time with authority in his posture. "Sir, I need you seated immediately. We are moments from takeoff. That stroller has been cleared. Please sit down." Warren didn't budge. He simply turned his head and stared down at Darian, who looked back, calm, measured, unmoved. "This is exactly how accidents happen," Warren muttered darkly. Reddick stepped closer, his voice firmer. "Sir, take your seat now, or the captain will be informed." That broke the moment. With a theatrical snort, Warren dropped back into his seat. But the way he settled was more a performance than a concession. His arms crossed again, but his posture leaned forward, just enough to make his looming presence felt. The plane rolled forward, engines rumbling with increasing force. As momentum pushed passengers into their seats, Darian closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to anchor himself. He didn't want conflict. He didn't need trouble. All he needed was to make it to Varcrest. The future of his company depended on that meeting. As the nose lifted off the runway and the cabin shifted into ascent, Darian reopened his eyes and reached instinctively for the stroller again. Still locked, still steady. But behind him, barely audible over the rising wind outside, Warren leaned in and whispered, his voice a blade cutting through the chill of pressurized air. This is exactly why accidents happen. 15 minutes into the flight, Warren Gellan stood without warning. His seatbelt clicked free with a sharp snap, drawing glances as he rose again, despite the glowing sign above warning passengers to remain seated. Without hesitation, he began pacing the narrow aisle with slow, deliberate steps, hands behind his back as though inspecting the cabin for defects. His tall frame loomed awkwardly over seated passengers, and with each pass, he drew closer to Darian Keller's row. Darian sat still, one hand gently resting on the handle of the compact stroller beside his legs, the other softly patting his son's back beneath a blanket. Laron stirred slightly, but did not cry. The soft drone of the engines filled the silence between movements. Warren's shoes tapped with increasing rhythm. He passed once, twice. On the third pass, his shoulder brushed the edge of the stroller, not enough to cause damage, but enough to jolt it slightly off angle. Darian reached out instinctively, straightening it, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, please be careful." Warren paused. He turned his head slowly and, for the first time, locked eyes with Darian. His lips curled upward in a smirk that held no humor. "I was careful," he replied, his voice dry, indifferent. Then he scoffed and continued pacing, as if nothing had happened. Darian watched him return to his seat a row behind. The man's movements were precise, almost rehearsed. Something in Warren's demeanor, his calm provocation, his smug dismissal, triggered a shift in Darian's awareness. This wasn't simple irritation anymore. It was becoming something darker. The seatbelt sign remained on, and Reddick Varson approached, clipboard in hand, forcing a smile as he tried to restore calm. "Sir," Reddick said to Warren, "I'll need you to remain seated until the sign is off. Turbulence is still expected during the climb." "I've flown enough to know when turbulence is real," Warren said without looking up. "The problem isn't the air, it's what's blocking it." He gestured subtly at Darian's stroller. Reddick glanced nervously at Darian, then at the stroller, clearly noting that it was compact, locked, and well within regulation. He said nothing to Warren, only nodded and turned to return to the galley. Darian noticed that Reddick's hands were trembling slightly. The next disturbance came quickly. Warren pulled a water bottle from the seat pocket in front of him, unscrewed the cap, and, accidentally, tipped it onto the floor. The clear liquid spilled and flowed in a narrow stream toward the stroller's wheels. "Really?" Warren muttered loudly. "Who leaves something like that in the way?" Darian's jaw tightened. He pulled the stroller back a few inches, avoiding the water and damage. Before he could speak, Jalen Court, the purser, stepped in. "Is there a problem here?" Jalen asked, glancing from Warren to Darian. Warren stood again, gesturing toward the stroller as though it were a threat. "Yes, there is. That thing is blocking cabin flow. It's dangerous. This entire setup violates safe movement protocols." Jalen shook his head. "The stroller's been cleared and documented. It meets all safety requirements for in-cabin use." "Doesn't feel very safe to me," Warren snapped. "I'm not comfortable flying with trip hazards next to me." "It's secured," Darian said, his voice steady. "I'm not going to move it because you're uncomfortable." The tone between the two men was measured, but sharp. Several passengers looked over their shoulders now, catching the rising tension. Warren's expression hardened. "Of course, you wouldn't move it." Before Jalen could respond, Darian caught something else, an odd shift in Reddick Varson's behavior. The senior attendant had returned and stood nearby, watching the exchange. But he said nothing. In fact, his posture seemed frozen, eyes unfocused. Then came the moment that changed everything. Warren leaned forward as if brushing lint from his pant leg, but instead he tilted slightly toward Reddick and whispered something too quietly for the others to hear. Darian caught only the final words. "You know why I'm here." Reddick stiffened, a visible tremor running through him as though he'd been struck by an invisible force. His jaw twitched. He blinked rapidly. Darian didn't miss it. His suspicion, buried beneath layers of patience and restraint, now surfaced with clarity. Something was wrong, something that had nothing to do with strollers or safety. Warren wasn't just another entitled passenger. Darian's instincts had kept him safe his entire life, through challenges in boardrooms, labs, and public spaces where his calm was mistaken for weakness. Now, those instincts screamed one truth. This was not a coincidence. Warren hadn't just happened to board this flight. He was here with purpose. As though he had boarded the flight with a purpose that went far beyond annoyance. Warren stood again. It wasn't casual. His seatbelt unclasped with a click that cut through the low hum of the cabin, and he rose in a way that startled everyone around him. The aircraft had just leveled off into smoother air, the kind that usually brings relief. But Warren moved with sharpness, his knee hitting the armrest of the seat ahead, his elbow knocking into a tray table as he shoved his way into the aisle. Several passengers flinched instinctively, startled by the abruptness. Reddick Varson reacted quickly from his post in the forward galley. "Sir, please take your seat," he said, moving toward Warren with trained urgency. His voice remained even, but his posture showed concern. Warren didn't listen. He barreled past Reddick's outstretched hand, muttering something under his breath that only the nearby row could hear. Darian, sitting just ahead with LaRon dozing lightly in the compact stroller, noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere. He pulled the stroller closer with one hand and braced with the other, already on edge. Then, without hesitation, Warren stepped beside Darian's row, twisted his foot outward, and delivered a deliberate, bone-echoing kick to the stroller. The sound of rubber skidding against vinyl flooring cut through the air like a shot. The stroller jolted forward several inches, the locked brake scraping uselessly across the floor. LaRon jerked awake instantly, letting out a sharp, terrified wail. Gasps erupted from surrounding passengers. Someone shouted, "Hey!" Another voice muttered, "What was that?" Darian shot to his feet, his arm catching the stroller before it tipped forward. His pulse thudded in his neck. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the raw surge of protective instinct now burning through him. LaRon was crying, loud and shaken. The sound pierced the pressurized silence, unignorable and raw. Warren stepped back slowly, a smirk forming on his lips as though he had achieved some quiet victory. His eyes met Darian's, not with apology, but with challenge. "You need to move that thing," Warren said coldly, his voice low, cruel. Darian didn't respond. He was focused entirely on LaRon, crouching to check if his son was okay, brushing a trembling hand across the infant's cheek and adjusting the blanket. The stroller's brake lever had bent, useless now. But LaRon, despite the shock, had no visible injuries. That was all that mattered, for now. Then, without warning, the aircraft dropped. A sudden air pocket caught the plane mid-level flight, jerking it down with a stomach-turning jolt. Gasps and nervous cries spread again as overhead compartments rattled and passengers gripped armrests. The motion was brief, but violent enough to throw off balance anyone standing. Warren had no time to adjust. His body, unbraced and leaning backward, slammed into the edge of the overhead bin with a sickening crack. The sound echoed across the cabin as his legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed sideways into the aisle, clutching his neck with both hands. Chaos broke instantly. "Medical team! Medical team!" Jalen Court's voice rang out from mid-cabin as he activated the crew panel. already moving forward with a first aid kit in hand. Passengers stood up despite the warnings, trying to get a view. Laurent's cries mixed with alarmed voices. Some passengers tried to calm others, some simply stared. Reddick froze mid-motion, torn between helping Warren and managing the swelling tension that now hovered over every row. Warren screamed, loud and desperate. "He hit me," he shouted, his voice ragged. "He threw it at me. That man launched the stroller. My neck. He tried to hurt me." Darian stood in stunned silence for a moment, blinking in disbelief. The accusation didn't even match the laws of motion, much less reality. He stepped forward slightly, voice calm but firm. "That's not what happened," he said, trying to be heard. "He kicked the stroller. I was seated. You can ask anyone who—" "He's lying," Warren shrieked, his body now curled on the floor, though suspiciously capable of shifting to a more visible position. "He's dangerous. He used the baby as cover." The lie shattered the calm like glass under pressure. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Some had seen Warren's kick. Others had only turned at the sound of the impact. Turbulence had distracted many in that crucial moment. Reddick stood still, eyes darting between Warren, the passengers, and Darian. His face showed more than confusion now. It showed hesitation and fear. Not fear of the situation itself, but of something older, buried beneath the performance. Something Warren had said earlier, perhaps. Jalen knelt beside Warren, checking for visible injuries. The neck brace hadn't yet arrived from the medical kit storage. Warren's breathing was fast, erratic, but his words came too clear, too directed. "He pushed it," Warren groaned. "He timed it with the turbulence. I know what I felt." Darian stepped back as several passengers watched him closely. He could feel the shift in their perception, like water turning murky. He looked down at Laurent, who had calmed only slightly, the tears still wet on his cheeks. The stroller sat damaged beside him, its brake bent, its front wheels out of alignment. A symbol now, not just of parental care, but of violation. Reddick slowly reached for the intercom. "Captain," he said into the mic, voice hollow. "Cabin incident. Medical needed. Possible passenger altercation. One injured, requesting guidance." Darian closed his eyes briefly. He could feel the tide turning against him. Not because of evidence, but because of confusion, because of performance, because one man had turned a moment of cruelty into a spectacle of deception. Then came the final blow. As Jalen stood to speak with the captain directly, Warren's voice dropped into a whisper, sharp and venomous, just loud enough for the people near him to hear, especially Darian. "He kicked me first." "Everyone remain seated," the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, measured but firm. "We are assessing the situation. Please stay calm." Darian didn't move. His arms cradled Laurent against his chest, his fingertips gently rubbing small circles on his son's back in an instinctive rhythm of protection. But his heart pounded in a discordant tempo, every beat warning him that control was slipping, fast. Warren was already performing. Slouched in his seat like a wounded martyr, he let out an exaggerated groan as if he had been the victim of a devastating blow. His hand clutched at his neck, fingers trembling with just enough theatricality to draw gasps from a few nearby passengers. "He slammed the stroller into me," Warren shouted, voice cracking for effect. "Deliberate, violent. I need a doctor now." Darian's eyes widened. "That's not what happened," he said clearly, but his voice was buried under Warren's volume. "He kicked the stroller. It slid. He fell when the plane shook." "Oh, now I fell, did I?" Warren snarled back, his groan briefly forgotten. "You attacked me. You think you're going to walk away from this?" Jalen Court was already moving down the aisle, trying to gather clarity from the chaos. He crouched beside Darian first. "Mr. Keller, I need to ask, did you push the stroller toward him?" His tone wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't confident either. "No," Darian replied, steady but strained. "He kicked it. My son woke up crying. I stood up to stop the stroller from tipping. Then the plane jolted, he lost his balance and hit his head. Jalen nodded but kept his eyes moving. Understood. Stay here for now. A few passengers offered pieces of what they saw. One man said he heard a loud bang. Another said he saw Warren standing when he wasn't supposed to. A middle-aged passenger confirmed the kick, but admitted he looked away during the actual fall. Turbulence had masked everything. The truth was blurring. Warren saw it and seized the opening. "I demand a neck brace," he declared, "and this plane needs to divert. My life could be in danger." Jalen hesitated, looking over at Reddick Varson, who lingered awkwardly at the galley wall, expression unreadable. His earlier reactions had unsettled Darian. Too quiet, too controlled, as if something else was pulling his strings. Laren whimpered and shifted against Darian's chest, letting out a tired cry that fractured the tension briefly. Darian rocked him gently, whispering, "It's okay, little one. I've got you. We're all right." But the sense of control was fleeting. The stroller's bent brake, still resting crooked near his feet, felt symbolic, like something that had been violated and could no longer serve its purpose. A small crack, visible only to those paying attention, but enough to suggest something had broken beneath the surface of this flight. Then, from 2 rows back, a hand slowly rose. "Excuse me," came a soft voice. It belonged to a thin, anxious-looking man in a gray jacket, his expression nervous but resolute. I think I recorded something. On my tablet." Everyone turned. It was Harlan Trev. Jalen stepped toward him, hopeful. "You think it caught the incident?" "I'm not sure if it caught the actual kick," Harlan admitted, his voice shaking. "But I started recording when things felt wrong. Maybe it helps." A flicker of hope passed through Darian's chest. His eyes met Harlan's, quietly pleading. This could be the break he needed. But then, "You show that," Warren's voice cut across the aisle like a blade, low and venomous. "And I'll make sure you regret it." The words struck like a whip crack. The atmosphere froze. Jalen stepped back instinctively. His training told him Warren was dangerous, but his authority had no precedent for this kind of manipulation. Harlan's fingers hovered uncertainly above the tablet, his courage visibly draining. "Hey," Darian said quietly, addressing Harlan now. "Whatever you have, it matters." But Harlan hesitated, sweat forming at his brow, hands trembling slightly. He didn't speak. He didn't move. Warren's gaze remained locked on him, piercing, loaded with a threat unspoken but deeply understood. Reddick didn't intervene. He simply stood there, arms crossed, eyes lowered. Darian realized something important then. This wasn't just a passenger incident. This wasn't about a man with a temper. It was bigger, layered. Warren's confidence, Reddick's silence, the way every twist of the story seemed rehearsed. Darian began to see it for what it was. A trap. One that had been unfolding slowly, deliberately from the moment the cabin doors had closed. Captain Marendelier's voice returned overhead, calm but firm. "We understand this is a difficult situation. Our crew is working to ensure the safety of all passengers. Please remain seated and await further instructions." The cabin returned to silence, but it was no longer neutral. It was loaded with fear, confusion, and a storm of truths trying to claw their way to the surface. Darian held Laron close, his jaw tight, his mind racing not with panic, but with preparation. This wasn't over. It was only changing shape. Warren leaned back into his seat, smiled faintly at Darian, and whispered just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That video won't save you." Captain Marendelier's message arrived like a crack of thunder in a quiet storm. The situation had officially escalated to a safety concern, forcing the crew into strict protocol. Jalen Court, still holding his tablet tightly, moved swiftly back toward row 17 where Warren Gellan sat slouched, wrapped in drama and a self-declared neck injury. "Sir, "We're going to do everything we can to stabilize you until landing," he said, voice firm yet professional. But Warren wasn't interested in stability. He wanted control. "He needs to be restrained," Warren howled, jabbing a trembling finger toward Darian, who was seated just a few feet ahead, clutching his infant son, Laron, protectively. "He attacked me. He threw that stroller like a weapon." Darian shook his head, voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "That's not what happened. He kicked the stroller. My son was inside." Warren screamed over him, panting with an exaggerated rhythm as though auditioning for tragedy. "He's violent. He's lying. You're endangering all of us if you let him sit there." He punctuated the last sentence by clawing at his neck brace and wincing theatrically. Reddick Varson arrived next, trying once more to act as peacemaker. "Let's all stay calm." Warren cut him off with a sharp twist of his body and a sudden spasm that drew gasps from nearby passengers. "I can't breathe. I can't," he croaked, flailing one arm weakly as if on the verge of collapse. His face contorted into something between panic and performance. "I'm going to faint." It was too much. Too sudden. Too clean. Several passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. A man across the aisle pulled his feet closer. A boy near the window looked away. Something in Warren's display felt off. Too timed, too polished. Jalen leaned toward Reddick and muttered, "What is this guy doing?" Reddick didn't answer. His lips tightened, his jaw clenched, but the paleness creeping across his face said more than words could. Then, quietly, a whisper from behind. "He's flagged." The voice belonged to Orrin Delk, the youngest attendant on the flight, barely older than a college graduate but sharp-eyed and soft-spoken. He leaned toward Jalen, barely audible over the cabin noise. His name, Warren Gellin. There's a conflict risk flag next to it in the manifest. I wasn't sure it was serious until now. Jalen blinked, stunned. That list actually gets used? Only for internal cross-reference, rarely comes up. Orrin's throat bobbed nervously. But it's there. That detail landed like a weight in Darian's mind. A creeping truth began to form. Warren wasn't just angry, he was prepared. And not for the kind of confrontation one stumbles into. He was orchestrating something. Jalen stepped back, weighing options. He turned to Darian. "Sir, I want to move you and your son a few rows forward. It's not a punishment, just a precaution until we land." Darian nodded. He understood. But before he could even unbuckle, Warren's voice cut the air like a whip. "No, you're not letting him run away from accountability." His voice, suddenly stronger despite the supposed injury, snapped everyone's attention back. "He doesn't get to just roll away like nothing happened." Laron stirred in Darian's arms, whimpering from the noise. Darian rocked him gently, whispering reassurances into the boy's tiny ear. But inside, Darian felt the walls closing. He wasn't just being moved, he was being repositioned in someone else's story. The aircraft rocked with a brief tremor of turbulence, amplifying the unease. Overhead lights flickered for a half-second. A murmur passed down the cabin like the rustle of wind before a storm. In row 19, Harlan Trev sat frozen, eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his tablet. His fingers hovered over it, trembling. His face was pale, jaw clenched, breath shallow. He looked like a man on the verge of choosing between truth and fear. Darian caught the flicker of movement. He saw the screen. The video was there. It had to be. But before Harlan could act, Reddick Varson appeared beside him, hand settling firmly on his shoulder. The two men locked eyes. Reddick spoke low, so low Darian couldn't hear the words, but the effect was immediate. Harlan's hands stopped moving. His thumb hovered above the tablet's lock screen, then slowly lowered. The display darkened. The truth disappeared into the shadows. Darian's heart dropped. He knew what had happened. Reddick wasn't just afraid of Warren, he was entangled with him. In the corner of his vision, Warren sat reclining again, breathing slowly, as if satisfied. The performative pain returned, but now it was just a mask. His neck brace was tilted slightly, but he made no effort to fix it. Instead, he stared forward, lips curling into a slight, smug smile. Darian turned to Oren, who had quietly approached with a folded blanket for Laron. Oren hesitated before speaking, voice low. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Reddick used to work for a private travel security firm," he said, not meeting Darian's eyes. "One of those companies that handles sensitive clients, the kind who expect a certain treatment." Darian said nothing, but the pieces were falling into place faster than he could speak. Warren wasn't just a manipulative passenger, he was connected, and he had boarded this flight expecting to cause a scene, perhaps even knowing the outcome ahead of time. Reddick returned to Warren's side, standing stiffly as the neck brace was adjusted by Jalen. The purser tried to maintain professionalism, but something had changed in his eyes. He had seen too much to pretend anymore. As Warren leaned back, eyes half-lidded, he muttered just loud enough for the cabin to hear, "You know the agreement." Reddick didn't respond. He simply stared forward, face pale, as though the trap had closed around him too. Darian sank back into his new seat, arms wrapped around his child, and felt the gravity of the moment settle over him like a weight. Everything about this flight now felt rehearsed, coordinated. He didn't know what Warren had planned before stepping onto the aircraft, but he knew this much. It wasn't about the stroller. The atmosphere felt like a trap closing, leaving Darian to wonder what exactly Warren had planned before stepping onto this flight. The order was given. "Mr. Keller, please relocate 3 rows forward with your child," Jalen Court said in a level but strained voice, glancing back at Captain Delaire's closed cockpit door. "It's for safety protocol. We'll keep the aisles clear and monitor the situation closely." Darian didn't argue. He rose slowly, unfastening the brake on the damaged stroller with one hand while the other kept Laron close to his chest. The stroller's front wheel wobbled slightly, its frame still bent from the earlier assault, but Darian maneuvered it carefully into the aisle. He hadn't taken more than a step when, "Ah! He's doing it again!" Warren Gellen's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. Passengers winced. Some groaned audibly. Warren clutched his neck brace dramatically, as if the mere movement of the stroller were a renewed attack. His voice took on an operatic wail, hands flailing as if repelling a ghost. Theatrics, unmistakably staged. I remember now," Warren shouted suddenly, eyes wide as if unlocking a terrible memory. "He did it on purpose. That man rammed me because of long-standing hatred." Gasps rose across the rows, followed by stunned silence. Darian froze mid-step, his grip tightening on the stroller's frame. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "I've never seen you before today." Warren pointed a trembling, accusatory finger. "That's what you want them to think. But we've met before, haven't we? Years ago. You were just waiting for a chance to finish what you started." The words were absurd. But absurdity, when spoken with confidence, can seed doubt. That's what made it dangerous. Jalen's brow furrowed. "Warren, let's focus on the facts. He's trying to move away so he can do it again. This is strategy," Warren roared, cutting Jalen off. Darian lowered his eyes briefly, breathing through the pressure mounting in his chest. The stroller hadn't even brushed Warren, and yet here he was, being painted as a violent man with a grudge against a stranger. He reached the designated row and carefully locked the stroller next to the aisle seat. Laron squirmed slightly in his arms, disturbed but not crying. Darian sat down, nodding gently to his son, as if to promise, "I've got you." Then he noticed it. 2 rows behind, Harlan Trev, nervous, unassuming, had slowly pulled out his tablet. His hands trembled as he opened the screen and began navigating to the video file. His eyes darted to Warren, then to Darian. When their gazes met, Darian gave a subtle nod. A quiet plea. Be brave. But before Harlan could tap the screen, a shadow loomed. Reddick Varson stepped forward, face unreadable, and placed a firm hand on Harlan's shoulder. He leaned down, speaking low enough that no one else could hear. Harlan stiffened. His hand hovered over the play button, then lowered. He tapped the screen off. The tablet went dark. Darian's hope collapsed like a punctured lung. From his new seat, he could still see Warren, who watched the exchange with a satisfied, knowing smirk. He adjusted the neck brace theatrically as if confirming his role, and for a moment he looked straight at Darian, as if savoring the control he still held. Orrin Delk, the junior attendant, stepped quietly beside Darian. His whisper was barely audible over the dull hum of the engines. "Reddick used to work with a travel security firm," he murmured. "Handled sensitive clients. The kind with leverage. Just thought you should know." Darian turned toward him slowly, trying not to let the anger show in his face. "So Warren isn't just some angry passenger." Orrin glanced toward the rear galley where Reddick had disappeared with Harlan. "No, he's something else, and Reddick's not choosing his words out of fear of policy. It's fear of fallout." That small truth landed like a stone in Darian's stomach. The pieces had been scattered throughout the flight, but now they began to align. Warren's overconfidence, his threats, Reddick's earlier silence. The manipulations layered into every word he spoke. Warren hadn't boarded the plane to travel. He had boarded to trigger. And Darian had become the perfect mark. A quiet father, distracted by an infant, easy to frame. Warren groaned again, theatrically leaning back as the neck brace was fitted snugly. A few passengers shot him tired, suspicious looks. But not enough. Not yet. As the tension returned to a simmer, Warren shifted slightly, settling into his seat. The smirk returned, now faintly twisted into something more sinister. He tilted his head just enough to project his final words across the aisle, soft but precise, as if they were carved into ice. "He thinks moving seats will save him." The passenger smirked, confident his attack would go unchallenged, unaware that every move, every witness, and every second had already been calculated by a father who doesn't tolerate harm to his family. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets unstoppable force, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Captain Mirandelier's voice crackled over the intercom just as the aircraft began to settle into a faint glide. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a reported passenger injury and an unresolved safety concern, we are diverting to Velstrom Field. Please remain calm and seated until further instructions." The announcement rippled through the cabin like a sudden change in cabin pressure. Murmurs erupted. A few passengers exchanged nervous glances, others looked up sharply, and some shook their heads in exasperation. No one really knew what had happened, only that tension had been building, and now the entire flight was paying the price. Darian Keller sat frozen, his infant son, Laron, wrapped in his arms. The boy's tiny fingers clung to his father's shirt as though even he, in his sleep-addled innocence, sensed the shift in atmosphere. Darian gently bounced him in his lap, whispering softly, not only to soothe the child but to anchor his own rising panic. The weight of uncertainty closed in from all directions. Somewhere behind him, Warren Gellin was still moaning, theatrically clutching his neck in an endless performance of pain. Yet Darian had seen the break in that act, the cruel smirk that had followed the kick to the stroller, the precise timing of his fall, and the sudden clarity in Warren's expression when no one was looking. But Darian couldn't prove any of it. Not yet. Then, like a ripple through murky water, a voice rose. I saw the stroller get kicked." Heads turned. The cabin quieted. It was Harlan Trev, middle-aged, bespectacled. The quiet man seated 2 rows back. He stood with shaky knees, holding his tablet like a shield. The moment hung, suspended in breathless tension. Jalen Court stepped forward. "Can you repeat that, sir?" Harlan swallowed hard. "Warren kicked the stroller. I saw it. I recorded part of it, I think. But I I'm not sure how much got captured. I was nervous. A collective breath stirred the cabin air. Darian turned, hope flickering for the first time since the ordeal began. But just as quickly, the cold wind returned. Reddick Varson stepped in fast. There's no need for speculation. That area of the aisle isn't covered. The forward cabin panel doesn't record that stretch. Darian's eyes narrowed. That wasn't true. He remembered the layout. He remembered glancing at the cabin panel earlier in the flight. It did cover that section, at least partially. Before he could speak, Orrin Delk, the younger flight attendant, turned from the galley. Actually, it does. The panel's angle includes part of the forward aisle, especially where the stroller was positioned. The cabin turned again. Reddick's jaw tightened, the flash of something sharp crossing his expression before he could mask it. Darian saw it. Fear, not confusion. Reddick wasn't merely misinformed. He was protecting someone. Warren let out a raspy laugh from behind them, loud enough to cut through the rising unease. Truth becomes whatever people fear the most. The words weren't said in rage or panic. They were smooth, practiced, too calculated for someone supposedly in pain. Darian's stomach dropped. This wasn't just about a stroller. Not anymore. Warren continued, his voice drifting casually through the tense air. You think video proves anything? All it takes is one doubt, one hesitation, and the truth becomes mud. He turned toward Harlan, who had slowly started lowering his tablet. You show that, and I'll make sure you regret it. The threat wasn't shouted. It was whispered with the ease of someone who had made such promises before. Harlan froze. His hands trembled. Darian wanted to speak up, to reassure the man, but the words caught in his throat. If he pushed too hard, it would only look worse. Reddick didn't respond. He stood silently near the beverage cart, eyes locked on the carpet. Jalen stepped between Warren and Harlan. That's enough, he said firmly, but even his voice held a tremor of doubt. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft began its descent. A soft chime echoed overhead. Darian felt the plane dip slightly, the engines shifting tone as they began their approach into Velstrom Field. More whispers rose from the passengers, some blaming Darian for escalating things, others wondering aloud if Warren was faking. But it was clear that confusion ruled the aisle now, and truth was beginning to blur in the fog of performance, fear, and misdirection. Darian looked down at his son. Leron had calmed, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily against his father's. Darian brushed his thumb gently along the boy's cheek. We're okay, he whispered. We're going to be okay. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he had to say it. For both of them. As the cabin tilted gently into landing position, Warren leaned his head back, still cradling his neck brace, still playing the victim, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. And then, just before the wheels touched down, Warren's voice broke the stillness, low and deliberate, spoken just loudly enough for surrounding passengers to hear. When we land, he'll realize none of this was ever about a stroller. The wheels struck the tarmac with a deep, rolling thud that rippled through the cabin like distant thunder. A few overhead bins rattled. Gasps echoed from passengers jolted by the landing. But Darian Keller didn't flinch. His arms remained locked tightly around his infant son, Leron, whose small fists gripped his collar with surprising strength. The child's soft breath came in tiny, trembling bursts, his cheek pressed to his father's chest. Darian's heartbeat thudded harder than the landing gear, not because of the descent, but because of the man just a few rows behind them. The lights in the cabin dimmed automatically, washing the aisle in a cold amber glow. Shadows stretched across Warren Gellen's face, but they couldn't conceal what Darian saw next. The act dropped. Completely. For one fleeting second, Warren stopped groaning, stopped twitching, stopped wincing like an injured martyr. His head tilted slightly, as if analyzing something. His fingers loosened from the seat armrest. His face became cold and alert, not like someone in pain, but like someone who had just confirmed a plan was unfolding as expected. From across the aisle, Jalen Court saw it too. The purser had been juggling passenger concerns for the past hour, but in that sliver of stillness, he paused. His brow furrowed. He leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing on Warren as if seeing him for the first time. Not the victim Warren claimed to be, but the calculated force Darian had begun to suspect all along. Darian's gaze cut sideways toward Reddick Varson. The senior attendant stood unnaturally stiff near Warren's row, eyes darting from Warren's face to the floor, like someone awaiting a signal they didn't want to receive. Darian caught a whisper. "Make sure the report says he pushed it." The voice was low, but Darian's ears sharpened like radar. It was Warren, the same man who had kicked his son's stroller, the same man who had played the role of a victim so convincingly, some of the cabin had started believing him. Now, with no shame, he issued quiet instructions like a man managing a chessboard. Reddick gave a reluctant nod. Small, almost invisible. But Darian saw it. He turned his face slightly toward Laron, pressing a kiss into the boy's soft hair, not just to comfort him, but to steady himself. His thoughts spun, calculating rapidly. If Reddick submitted a false statement to security, if Warren stuck to his story, if the crew faltered in the face of confusion, then Darian could walk off this plane branded as the aggressor, a father who had injured a passenger, a man traveling with a child who had caused disruption. Darian wasn't just trying to clear his name anymore. He was trying to preserve the future of the boy in his arms. Harlan Trev sat 2 rows behind. Darian caught him in the side mirror of his thoughts, tensed, pale, clutching the tablet like it was burning in his hands. The man had said he recorded something, had nearly shown it. But then Reddick had interfered. And now Harlan was stuck, torn between doing what was right and keeping his head down. Darian didn't blame him, but he needed him. "Please," Darian whispered more to himself than anyone else, "do the right thing." The aircraft slowed as it taxied toward the terminal at Velstrom Field. Outside, terminal lights shimmered like distant searchlights cutting through mist. Inside, silence had returned. Not a restful silence, but a waiting silence, the kind that fills courtrooms just before the verdict. Jalen moved down the aisle, murmuring polite instructions for passengers to remain seated until airport security and medical staff arrived. His voice was even, but Darian could see the strain behind his eyes. Warren leaned back now, reclined slightly in his seat like a man who had rehearsed this ending a dozen times. His smirk wasn't wide, but it was present, thin-lipped and chilling, like a storm cloud that knows it has already broken the roof. Darian's hands tensed on Laron's back. Every breath his son took grounded him further in the moment. He thought about the stroller, its bent brakes still jammed from the force of Warren's kick. He thought about Reddick's nervous glances and what they meant. He thought about the plane slowing to a stop and what waited on the other side of that cabin door. Then came the line, clear, icy, loud enough for the rows around him to hear. "The moment that door opens, everything shifts in my favor." The cabin door hissed open with a sharp hydraulic gasp, cutting through the stifling silence like a blade. 2 airport medics stepped in first, carrying their bags with professional urgency. Right behind them followed 2 uniformed officers from Velstrom Field Security, Officer Tren Varick, tall and stocky with squared shoulders, and Officer Halden Rusk, leaner, with a hawkish gaze that scanned the tense cabin like a battlefield. Warren Gellin wasted no time. "There he is," Warren bellowed, jabbing a trembling finger toward Darian. "That man attacked me. He slammed that stroller into my neck." His voice was raw, loud enough to draw startled glances from passengers who had tried to stay uninvolved. In his seat near the rear, Darian held Laron close, the baby's soft breath pressed against his father's chest. Darian didn't flinch, but the pressure in his chest tightened. The medics moved quickly to Warren, who was sprawled across a stretcher positioned at the back of the cabin, his neck secured in a brace he had demanded earlier. Every time they touched him, Warren flinched dramatically. "Careful," he yelped as one medic adjusted the strap near his clavicle. "It feels like something snapped. He shoved the stroller right into me with full force." Reddick Varson, standing stiffly by the bulkhead, stepped forward with the hesitancy of a man calculating risk rather than seeking truth. When Officer Rusk turned to him for a statement, Reddick spoke with measured detachment. I didn't clearly see what happened at that exact moment. I was distracted helping a passenger near row 12, he said, avoiding eye contact with Darian. Darian's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. Not yet. He could feel the trap tightening again. Officer Varick stepped beside him, one hand resting casually on the holster at his side. "Sir," Varick said, calm but firm, "for the time being, please remain seated until we've completed our assessment. We'll hear from everyone soon." Darian nodded silently, though everything inside him wanted to speak. The dramatic irony suffocated him. He, the one who had protected his son, was being treated like a potential threat. That's when it happened. From 2 rows back, a quiet voice broke the tension. "I saw something." All eyes turned. Harlan Trev, the soft-spoken passenger with a dark blue sweater and shaking hands, slowly rose from his seat. He held up his tablet, not confidently, but with the hesitant weight of a conscience finally taking over fear. "I didn't think I got the moment it happened," he said, voice trembling. "But I checked again, and I did capture something. Not the kick itself, but Warren, approaching the stroller just before it slid. You can see him lift his foot." Gasps murmured through the cabin. The atmosphere cracked open. Warren exploded. "That footage is incomplete. It's misleading. You don't know what you're looking at." His face, for the first time, lost the rehearsed agony and showed something raw. Panic. Jalen Court moved to Harlan's side, eyes wide. "Show me," he said, but they never got the chance. In a single, shocking movement, Warren sat up straight on the stretcher, abandoning his limp-necked performance entirely, and lunged toward Harlan. The neck brace flew askew as he surged forward, fingers clawing for the tablet like a man possessed. The action stunned everyone. For someone claiming a serious spinal injury, Warren moved with speed and coordination. The medics stumbled back. Harlan yelped and instinctively recoiled, clutching the tablet to his chest. Officers Varick and Rusk moved like clockwork. Rusk caught Warren mid-lunge, grabbing him by the shoulder and twisting him backward with practiced ease. Varick stepped in, locking Warren's arms behind him. The entire cabin had frozen. In the sudden stillness, Warren stood rigid, his body caught, his cover broken. The neck brace dangled awkwardly around his collar. Forgotten. The posture he held now was not that of a victim, but of someone unmasked. Officer Rusk stared at him and said slowly, clearly so every passenger could hear, "Sir, if you can move like this, your injury does not match your claims." Warren tried to recover his performance immediately, clutching at his neck with both hands as if the slightest movement sent sharp pain through him. His breath came out in dramatic gasps, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. It hurts worse now," he claimed, his voice trembling in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. But Officer Varick watched him closely, noting how Warren's shoulders remained steady, how his legs didn't wobble, and how his eyes darted, not with pain, but calculation. The security officers separated Warren from the rest of the passengers, guiding him toward the aisle while the medical team circled in. One of the medics gently adjusted the neck brace they had placed earlier, then stepped back with a confused frown. The readings on his handheld monitor were normal. Warren's pulse was steady. His responses were sharp. Nothing aligned with the dramatic display. "This doesn't match a serious injury," the medic murmured to Officer Rusk, who nodded slowly while watching Warren attempt another exaggerated wince. Meanwhile, Reddick Varson stood near the galley, hands shaking at his sides. Sweat collected at his hairline despite the cool cabin air. Officer Varick approached him with calm authority. "Mr. Varson," he said, keeping his tone neutral, "did this passenger threaten you or attempt to influence your reporting?" Reddick opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at the floor. Silence stretched long enough for the nearby passengers to turn their heads. His lack of denial felt louder than any confession. The weight of it pressed on the edges of the moment, creating a stillness that made even Laurent's soft whimpers sound sharp. Before Varric could ask further, Orrin Delk, the youngest flight attendant on the crew, stepped forward with visible fear trembling in his posture. His voice cracked as he spoke. He did make demands, Orrin admitted, glancing briefly at Warren before lowering his gaze. Before takeoff, he told us to move the stroller. He warned that there would be trouble if we didn't. The revelation hit the cabin like a cold wind. Jalen Court's eyes widened, his usually composed expression cracking with shock. "Reddick, why didn't you say this earlier?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a heavy blend of disappointment and dawning understanding. Reddick swallowed hard but couldn't form words. Warren, however, reacted instantly. "He's lying," he shouted, pointing at Orrin with a trembling hand. "He's trying to protect the man who attacked me." His voice rose, desperate and sharp, but the officers no longer leaned into the drama. They had begun to see through the cracks. Darien stepped forward then, gently rocking Laurent against his chest. His face showed exhaustion, but his eyes held steady, grounded strength. "I saw what happened," he said, his tone level and controlled. He stood up again and again. He kicked the stroller. Then he lied. His words carried weight not because they were loud, but because they were calm in a moment where calm felt impossible. One by one, passengers who had hesitated earlier found their voices. A man near the window spoke quietly. "I heard him taunting the father." Another added, "He kept standing even when the seatbelt sign was on." A third muttered, "He threatened that man with the tablet earlier." Piece by piece, the truth rebuilt itself, stronger than Warren's performance. Warren's confidence faltered visibly. His dramatic breathing slowed. His posture stiffened, not from pain, but from fear of losing control. "They're all mistaken," he insisted, but the tone lacked its earlier conviction. Officer Rusk stepped forward, his expression firm. "Mr. Gellin, based on witness statements and your behavior, you are being escorted off this aircraft for obstruction, false reporting, and endangerment of a child." A ripple moved through the passengers, relief mixed with lingering tension. Warren's face twisted with shock, then anger, then something cold and calculating as the officers took position beside him. He did not lash out this time. He did not shout. Instead, he leaned slightly toward Darien as the officers guided him down the aisle. His voice dropped into a whisper meant to be private, but several passengers around them heard it with perfect clarity. "This isn't over." The investigation lounge at Velstrom Field was quiet. Too quiet for what had just unfolded in the sky. No formal walls could contain the residue of tension that still clung to every passenger who stepped off Velora Skylift Flight 922, especially Darien Keller, who now sat in a gray armchair with his infant son, Laurent, nestled against his chest. His arms encircled the child protectively, as though his body alone could shield him from the confusion and cruelty that had struck mid-air. His breath was finally even, but his thoughts ran jagged. Around him, other passengers whispered, glanced, and speculated, while security personnel moved through the room with a practiced calm that felt oddly detached. Captain Marindelier approached with deliberate steps, the gravity of command still clinging to his posture. "Mr. Keller," he began, voice low, "I want to extend my personal apology for what you experienced aboard my aircraft. The crew should have acted faster. I promise you there will be a full internal review." Darien nodded, but said nothing. His mind had no space for apologies yet, only clarity. The stroller had been taken into evidence, its bent frame a quiet monument to the moment everything turned. A replacement was promised, but it wasn't the equipment Darien mourned. It was the illusion of safety he had boarded with. Then came the officer. Tren Varric re-entered the lounge with a brown folder tucked beneath his arm, and a look that had clearly sharpened since stepping off the tarmac. He walked over and leaned slightly forward as he spoke. "Mr. Keller, we've completed a preliminary check on the passenger in question. Warngellen," he said, tone tightening on the name. "He's not a first-time flyer and not new to disruption either." Darian lifted his head slightly. "Meaning?" Varric opened the folder, revealing several typed pages, each stamped and dated. "He's filed multiple strategic complaints over the past 2 years. Different airlines, different cities, same pattern. Provokes an incident, exaggerates injury, sues or settles." Darian's hands tightened around Laron. "So, I wasn't caught in the moment. I was chosen." "Exactly," Varric confirmed. "He targets those he thinks won't fight back. You fit that profile, a calm father, solo, focused on a child. Easy to distract, easier to frame." The realization settled like cold steel in Darian's gut. This wasn't a moment of misfortune. It had been a trap disguised as random conflict. At that moment, Harlan Trev entered from the far end of the lounge, hands shaking around the edges of his tablet. He paused, hesitant, until Darian locked eyes with him. The man stepped forward awkwardly, his voice apologetic before words even formed. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier," he said. "I was scared. But I shouldn't have waited." Darian offered a slow, sincere nod. "You still stood up. That matters." Before Harlan could respond, Jalen Court, the purser, joined them, holding his own report sheet. He didn't hesitate. "We reviewed the forward-facing cabin camera. While it didn't capture the exact moment of the kick, it did record Gellen shifting aggressively toward the aisle, right before the stroller moved. It supports the witness accounts." It was small, but it was enough. Reddick Varson approached next, his steps hesitant and his eyes avoiding direct contact. His voice barely lifted above a whisper. "He threatened to report me. Said he'd claim I was negligent if I didn't support his version. I panicked." Darian rose slowly from his seat, still holding Laron but standing eye to eye now. "You let that threat put my son at risk." "I know," Reddick muttered, his hands shaking. "I should have spoken sooner. I'm sorry." Darian looked at him, measuring his words not for revenge, but for truth. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to the next parent who might not get a second chance." Behind him, Officer Rusk joined Varric. The two officers were finalizing their report but paused to acknowledge Darian one last time. "You did everything right," Rusk said, voice steady and respectful. "You stayed calm. You protected your son. And because of that, we saw through the lie." Varric looked out the frosted window toward the silent aircraft, its engines cold, its cabin now emptied of pretense. "We've both worked a lot of field cases," he said, turning back to Darian. "But you handled this with more strength than many grown men I've seen in worse storms." The tension hadn't fully released by the time Darian Keller found himself seated at the quiet compensation desk inside Velstrom Field's administrative wing. The room was softly lit, its silence a jarring contrast to the chaos that had unfolded aboard Velora Skylift Flight 922 just hours earlier. A wall clock ticked gently above the window, its sound too calm, too distant. Laron, finally asleep, rested in Darian's arms, his tiny breaths warm against his father's chest. A representative from the airline, a stern-faced man named Baron Voss, sat across from Darian. His uniform bore the Velora insignia, but his voice was softer than the authority it implied. "We'd like to offer you full transport accommodations," Baron began, placing a sleek folder on the table. "A private aircraft to Varcrest is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Hotel suite tonight, transportation, meals, and a replacement stroller, all covered." Darian blinked, his gaze momentarily unfocused. The words felt distant, like echoes from a place untouched by what had happened. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice level, measured. "But this doesn't undo what my son went through." Baron cleared his throat and bowed his head in acknowledgement. "We know. and we're deeply sorry." Darian said nothing. The apology landed like a soft knock on a door that had already been shut tight. A short time later, Officer Rusk entered the room. Still in uniform, but now without the tense edge of in-flight protocol, he approached Darian with a folded set of documents in hand. "Mr. Keller," he said, stopping beside the desk, "I wanted to bring you this myself." Darian stood as Laurent stirred in his arms. "What is it?" "Update on the investigation," Rusk replied. "Warren Gellin is in custody. He's being charged with filing a false injury report, intimidation of a witness, and endangering a minor. We're also re-examining prior incidents linked to him." "There's a pattern." Darian narrowed his eyes. "You mean this wasn't the first time?" "No," Rusk said, lowering his voice. "Turns out Warren has a history of targeting passengers, parents especially, on commercial flights. He looks for situations he can manipulate. Files complaints, settles quietly. A scam, polished over time." Darian's grip on Laurent tightened. "He picked you," Rusk added, "because he assumed a busy father with a baby would panic, that you'd break under pressure, become easy to blame." "But I didn't," Darian murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "No," Rusk said, a subtle respect in his tone. "You didn't." The weight of that truth landed hard. All day, Darian had walked a tightrope of perception, between being seen as a protective father or an unstable aggressor. Warren had bet on the latter. He had played his role too well. But the gamble failed because Darian didn't bite. He never raised his voice, never swung back. He had clung to control with both hands, even as the narrative twisted against him. Later that evening, inside a modest but quiet hotel suite offered by the airline, Darian gently lowered Laurent into a crib by the window. The baby had finally drifted into a deep sleep, exhaustion weighing heavier on the child than on the man. For a moment, Darian watched him breathe. The soft rise and fall of his chest was the only thing anchoring Darian to the present. His laptop sat open on the desk behind him. Half-finished slides for tomorrow's presentation glowed quietly on the screen. Circuit diagrams, funding projections, prototype specs. A future that had nearly been stolen, not by failure, but by a stranger's lie. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Darian opened it to find Jalen Court, the purser from Flight 922, standing there with a folder and a tired but sincere expression. "I wanted to bring this in person," Jalen said, offering the folder. "It's from the airline. Official apology, signed by our operations director. Also, confirmation that our entire crew will be undergoing new situational response training, based on today." Darian took the folder. "Thank you. I know this wasn't easy on you either." Jalen hesitated, his eyes lowering briefly. "I should have acted sooner. I let the situation drag too long. I let a man twist the truth in front of me." "You helped correct it," Darian said. "That matters." Jalen nodded, grateful but still haunted. "You kept your head when most people would have lost it. And I'll remember that." Darian closed the door gently behind him. As the silence returned, he stepped to the window. Outside, the very aircraft that had carried them here now sat parked beneath floodlights. Quiet, neutral, innocent in appearance, yet it had become the stage for a brutal test of restraint, truth, and control. Darian returned to the crib and knelt beside it, his voice low, steady, and filled with something deeper than exhaustion. "We will always keep moving, little one." By landing, the passenger was in a neck brace, frozen in shock as the father's swift and precise action became a warning for anyone who dares harm the innocent. If you believe real authority protects with precision, courage, and decisive action, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores disrespect, abuse of authority, and the courage it takes to protect loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, respect, and integrity in all situations.